Welcome back to another dispatch from Hollie McKay. Well, in the insurance world, there's two things that they don't cover. Damage due to warfare and damage due to acts of God. And Hollie, so there's a part of the world that has suffered from both. And the latest one is an act of God, and that's an earthquake. And that's in the Syrian, Turkish area of the world where some devastatingly huge earthquakes have caused many large loss of life. So, can you tell us about what's going on over there from your perspective?
And the earthquakes are continuing weeks later. I mean, it's just not ending. So, at the beginning of February, there was really two massive earthquakes, a 7.8 and then a 7.5 that happened soon thereafter. And that sort of struck very early in the morning when everybody was still sort of sleeping. And that was in the sort of Turkey-Syria border region that was hugely affected, although you could feel aftershocks pretty much over the Middle East. And just, I mean, it looks like something out of just the worst horror movie you could imagine. You have entire apartments that just collapse to the ground. And I mean, last time I looked at the death toll, it was close to 60,000 and expected to continue because there are still so many tens of thousands of missing people. So it's just the scale of this tragedy is very hard to wrap my head around. And of course, I have a lot of friends in that area, having spent a lot of time working in the region. And, unfortunately, some of them did perish, and then other ones have survived. And they're living, in pretty horrid tents. It's the middle of winter. There is no heating. Most of them are terrified to go into any buildings. You've got people living in a car, people just living on the streets in this absolute freeze. So it's a really horrific sort of situation from a humanitarian point of view, and then it's been obviously very hard to even get aid into the affected parts of Syria because of the Assad regime and the sanctions, and sort of other restrictions there. So it's just all around been this huge tragedy, and it really broke my heart. I had a good friend of mine, I have a good friend of mine, who is Syrian, and his entire house was bombed during the war in Homs. And so after that, he had to flee with his children into sort of that southern part of Turkey. And then he lost everything he owned once again in this earthquake, and he's got four children, and they're all sort of living together in this tiny tent. And bless his heart, he sent me his resume, and he did this beautiful job of putting his sort of resume together, and just sort of said, I'm trying to get a job. How can I get a job? And I tried to send it around to a few people, but I think it's a very hard situation to come by right now. But I know, and I offered to send him money, and he wouldn't take it and said, no, 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 I don't want money. I need a job. So that just shows you sort of the resilience and the strength and the pride that a lot of Syrian people in particular have. I mean, wanting to be able to provide for their families. And you can only imagine how debilitating that is to have the four children that you love that are top of their class in school, only to feel like you can't sort of provide for them. And this is a very accomplished person. So it is a really just a huge tragedy on absolutely so many levels, and again, something I don't think has gotten the media attention that it should have received. And just the humanitarian suffering is, it's very hard, I think, to wrap my head around, because I just can't imagine that many people. And even he, everybody has this a story, but his was, hearing his friend, one of his friend's daughters sort of screaming and crying in the street and saying that her family was under the rubble, and they could hear them, and they were able to get sort of one of them out, and then they could still hear, two of the other family members, and then they were talking, and then eventually they stopped talking, and that was sort of the indication that they had passed away. And just to sort of be there and not be able to help and to go through that level of trauma for people that are already suffering from war, um, I just have no words for it sometimes, and I just have no words for it. So I think whatever we can do to support people in that area, I just hope that we do. And I think the US response itself needs to be more. I think that we give money to wars and to all sorts of other spending around the world, but this is a time that there are a lot of people who really need it.
So, when you look at the stories that are coming out of there, one of the things that strikes you immediately, well, first there's the magnitude of the devastation, which is, it's biblical in scale. There are just certain natural disasters that become so large that it's not people, it's like a humanity thing that it rises. I mean, like Fukushima was something that was of that scale, and then this thing is certainly qualifies of that scale. The
But if you look
response
at
to it,
just to one point on Fukushima, I mean, I think my understanding from Japan's last huge earthquake was it also had I think it was close to a 7.8, if not a 7.8. And I believe, 6 to 8 people died, which is very different compared to what will be 60, 80,000 people. And that also points to the level of corruption that existed, especially in southern Turkey, where people, they knew it was an earthquake zone. It sort of sits where there's four tectonic plates. But corruption enabled people to build apartment complexes they should never have had. There was no respect to the zoning laws. There was no respect to having the proper protocols in place. And so there are a lot of people that are very angry at Erdogan right now, as they rightfully should be, because a lot of people have lost lives because of that corruption. And as you know, Dennis, to me, corruption is the number one killer in pretty much every country. And we see that on absolute full display again with this tragedy.
yeah, you'll get no argument about that from me, my friend. It is corruption has ruined wars. Corruption has ruined societies. Corruption is at the very core of why, in this case, building codes in that are in place but are never followed allowed buildings to literally disintegrate while people were in them. Foreign aid to support this, as you look at it, it doesn't seem to be as big a magnitude as you would see from other disasters. And does the fact that there's a war going on and the politics of that war interfere with the ability of aid to get into a place like that right now?
I just think we're very distracted with Ukraine, to be honest. That's
Oh,
where the majority of the money is going.
okay. So it's really displacement of resources. I mean, because Turkey is on a side in that war, and which makes it normally where you would get a very large international response to something, there could be some hesitancy because it's a little bit harder to do that when you're talking about a world that is a bit more polarized than it was 5 years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just think,
Yeah,
yeah, people are
it's
distracted with other things.
yeah, well, it's tough. In the meantime, you're right. It's a lot of people that have been killed, and when you look at it at an individual level, it's tragic. When you look at it in this case, though, man, if you look at it at a societal level, it's still tragic because the percentage, it's like Japan, 6 people out of, like, there's millions of people there, right? And so it's a tiny percentage. And so their systems and their earthquake preparedness stuff works. But here, um, yeah, it's cataclysmic. And I mean, closing thoughts on what should be done in the future in that area, as far as, and do you think it's possible that anything will change, or do you think that
Well,
area
Turkey's
will
facing
stay?
elections, so people in Turkey need to vote with their feet. They need to vote and they need to, um, they keep voting this man in who clearly doesn't really respect human life. And it's an administration that's happy to take money over the backs of their own people. Um, so that's on the Turkish people need to reconcile that.
Yeah, well, it is where they live, and despite the fact that the forces of heaven and earth have deemed it to be one of the most dangerous earthquake places on earth, because those are all uplifts, is yeah, not much else that can be done. Tragic story, Holly. it's good to pay some attention to it and point out the fact that it could have been avoided, which is I think what this very last part of the interview is saying, that the level of carnage and loss could have been avoided by good planning and better attention to what one does. It's not like we don't know the engineering and we don't know the science, but that failed these people as well. And it's a sad story. Thanks, Holly.
Thank you.
Not really the most pleasant story, but it's one that I think is worth looking at and sharing and evaluating and keeping in mind. We'll talk to you again soon.
Thank you.